Hello GCSE students, welcome to this revision presentation about Key Topic 1 of the Cold War. I always say with the Cold War topic, it's a little bit like Marmite. Students either love it or they hate it. So hopefully if you're one of those students that doesn't particularly enjoy the Cold War or you've forgotten lots of it, hopefully this session will be useful for you. As I said, it's going to be focused on Key Topic 1 of the Cold War. The Cold War is 3 key topics, so Key Topics 2 and 3, the videos for that will be on my YouTube channel. Okay, so with the Cold War exam, you sit it alongside the British depth study, whichever topic it is that your school does for that one. So at my school we do Anglo-Saxon, Norman England, and you sit that paper alongside the Cold War one. So you have an hour and 50 minutes. It's called the Paper 2 exam. As I said, you sit both, you have both at the same time. It doesn't matter which order you do it in. So the questions for the Cold War part of the paper, of paper 2, the 3 questions that you get in the booklet, are all unique to the Cold War paper. There's no overlap. Some of your other GCSE questions, like the Explain Why question, is in the Germany paper, Crime and Punishment paper, and also the British depth topic, Anglo-Saxon, Norman England, or whichever one it is that you do. With the Cold War one, though, they are unique to that. You open up the paper, it starts with explain one consequence of one thing, explain one consequence of another thing. Okay, that's the you've got to think about what happened as a result of it. There's the narrative account question, which is question 2, which we'll also be looking at in a bit. And there's the explain 2 of the following, which is worth 16 marks out of the 32 marks of the Cold War paper. With that, you choose 2 of 3, and you've got to explain why 2 things from the Cold War are important for a particular focus or aspect of it. Okay, so just to go into a little bit more depth with the exam technique, with the explain one consequence, you've just got to think of something that happened as a consequence of it, whatever the event is, and then you've got to explain it. Okay, and with that, I'd think of it as a point evidence explain paragraph. One consequence of whatever it is, a little bit of knowledge about it, and then with the explanation, you've just got to say, this led to, this meant that. There's no particular focus for what the explanation needs to be focused on. So it could be to do with what it led to afterwards. It could be to do the impact it had on like the relationship between the Soviet Union and USA, or it could be something to do with like how the Cold War developed, those sorts of things. The second question in the paper is the narrative question. And this one, you're asked to write a narrative account about a certain aspect of the Cold War. It usually focuses on one of the crises, so it might look at like the Berlin crisis of 1948 to 49. And what you've got to think of, right, what's the start point, what's the end point? And you essentially write a historical knowledge of what happened. But with this, you're judging your level of historical knowledge, but also as well how well you show a clear sequence of events. Okay, so with this one, it's kind of a little bit like you're telling the story of what happened involving that area, but it has to move beyond being descriptive because you do need to show what happened in terms of a sequence of events. So this led to this, and I'll talk more about that later on as well. The final question, which is question 3, and this is going to be our main focus for today, because with question 3, as we go through this presentation, I've created plans for each possible question for Key Topic 1 that could come up for question 3. With this, I think it'd be really useful because if you are prepared to answer a question 3 question on the aspect, like explaining why it's important, which is worth 8 marks, that means you can also answer the explain one consequence one, okay? Because a consequence will be covered within why something is important. Okay, so what we'll do is, as we go through today, we're going to be focusing on planning plans for the importance question for every aspect that I think could come up in Key Topic 1. There's also a Google Doc of the plans that are below in the description of this video if you want to just look at those and revise them. So as we go through, as I said, we'll be doing a plan for each of those importance questions that could come up. Okay, the key thing for this question is, whenever I mark students' work, it's about making sure that the knowledge is focused on why it's important for whatever the focus is. Okay, so this, for example, this will be one we're looking later on. You've got why is the US development of atomic bomb important for relations between the superpowers in the years 45 to 49. it's important there that whatever your knowledge is, you're focusing on why it's important for the relations between the superpowers. Okay, so rather than just saying it's important because, you want to say why it's important for that relations. And the focus of it, so it often says, what the event, what was significant about it for. The for focus is often, these are some example ones I've done before. Superpower relations, which means the relationship between USA and the Soviet Union. The relationship between, or in that case, it's tension between East and West. Again, East and West is the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, Soviet Union being East, United States being West. But with West, you can also include within that Britain, the Western democracy, Britain, West Germany, France. With the East, you can also include alongside the Soviet Union, the Eastern European satellite states. You also have a more clearer one, just US-Soviet relations, which essentially is the same thing as that, superpower relations. And the example as well also like to think about the development of the Cold War as well. Like, how did that event, why was it important for developing the Cold War as we go forward? So with this, it's important that you focus your knowledge on whatever that focus is when you're explaining it. Okay. As I said at the start of this, we're thinking about aiming for grade 9. In terms of your knowledge of this, you want to have the years, you want statistics, you want specific knowledge. Okay, that's a feature of students that get level 9. I'm a history teacher at a school in Ware, and a lot of my students do very well at the top end in terms of getting those grade 9s. And when I look back at their scripts, if I look for their answers, there's years in there, there's statistics. That shows wide-ranging knowledge, which is what you need for grade 9. So today, with this presentation, I would like you at home, as we're going through this, to do this as a timeline. Okay, I think a timeline works really well for the Cold War topic because you've got to kind of know what comes as a result of it, and that's really important for the first question and the last question. Explain one consequence or explain for the following. What can be important is understand that sequence of what happened when. Okay, so on an A3 bit of paper, I would do the timeline up like this: 1941 up to 1958. Okay, and the first thing you can add on there is maybe in two different colours: the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union during this period. Okay, so I've got this here. This shows it for all three key topics. But what you'll want to do is you want to have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's the US president. He becomes president in 1933, and then he dies whilst in office in 1945. Okay, so on this timeline you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, up to 1945. We'll then have Harry Truman, and you can see he's 1945 up to 1953. And then for key topic 1, we've just got Dwight Eisenhower as well, who is 53, and then he goes up to 61 when JFK is elected. But for this timeline, he just goes up to 58. Okay, so we've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, and then for the Soviet Union leaders, we've got Joseph Stalin from around 1928-29. Vladimir Lenin dies in 24, but there's a power struggle, so we kind of say he's the leader by 1928-29. Joseph Stalin from this period up until 1953, and then after 53, we can have Nikita Khrushchev, which is very hard to spell, so I'll put that up there so you can see it. And you can obviously pause that if you need to look at it again. So what I would do is we go through the presentation today. On your timeline, I would add on the key events as we go through. Okay. In order to make this presentation, I've used a combination of different things. I've used my own knowledge. I've always been interested in the Cold War, but as well, I've used BBC Bitesize, the Pearson Edexcel GCSE textbook, and also the Hodder book as well. What's good about this is it means that I've drawn on like 3 different areas of knowledge to provide what I think's the best, because there are some examples where some of the books don't include a bit of knowledge which I think, well, that would be really useful for students to know about. Like, for example, in key topic 2, when the Berlin Wall's built, there's a standoff between USA and the Soviet Union at Checkpoint Charlie. We'll talk about that in the second video. The Pearson book doesn't mention that. The Hodder book does. So that's what I mean about including the best bits of knowledge that you can. Okay, so this is the checklist of what you need to know. We're going to go through it starting at the beginning of the Cold War, and ultimately with Edexcel GCSE, it's like they can only ask you what's on the specification. Okay, so what I've done is I've made these importance plans for as we go through for the different aspects, which will hopefully help with that. So the course is called Superpower Relations in the Cold War. What happens is before World War II, there's not two clear superpowers in the world. You kind of say before World War II, it's like France, Germany, USA, Russia emerging at that time as well as like bigger powers. But after World War II, because of the impact of it, particularly on like Britain with it losing its empire, it means that we emerge post World War II, so post 1945, with two kind of clear new giants in the world, and we call these like superpowers. Okay, and a lot of what this course is all about is the relationship between them, and that's the name of the course. It's called Superpower Relations in the Cold War, so it's a real focus on politically from above. So there's not, I said this before with the Cold War, you look at the building the Berlin Wall, for example. The escape attempts are really interesting. It's great to learn about them, but actually you're not really going to be writing about that in your exam. It's more about the impact that it has on the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, some students might write Russia, which would be factually incorrect for this time period, but Russia's one republic that makes up the Soviet Union, and it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You can in your exams you can call it the USSR or the Soviet Union. Obviously, USA, United States of America. So on the screen there, just some of the features of the Cold War. This is more of a revision lesson, so hopefully the Cold War will be quite familiar to you. The reasons why it's called the Cold War. The war doesn't ever turn hot, does it? And what we see is a series of like events and tension and crisis which lead to periods in history where the world was on the brink of having a nuclear war. But yeah, some of the features of it: spying, propaganda, arms race, space race, loans and aids. I thought as well like expansionism. One thing is like trying to expand their ideology, which we'll look at in a minute. Another one as well, containment, trying to contain the other side from their expansionism. But with this topic, we don't really look at spying. Propaganda, not so much as well. The space race is mentioned a little bit in Key Topic 2, but again, it's not a big part of the course. But ones like the arms race, the loans and aid, expansionism, containment, they're big things that we look at that you need to know about. One thing that's very important for understanding the first part of the Cold War is World War II. So hopefully you've got a little bit of a background to that. What I'll do now is just give you a little bit of a summary for what takes place. And what we see is World War II starts with the Nazi-Soviet Pact when they decide to carve up Poland, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which is over here. Okay, and when Germany invades Poland in September 1939, France and Britain, they guarantee Poland's independence, so they go to war with Germany. Okay. However, what's very interesting is the Soviet Union invade Poland from the east. That was part of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Excuse me. Fast forward 2 years to 1941, we see two new powers enter World War II. Okay, so we see Germany decide to invade the Soviet Union, and then it won't be on this map, but in December of 1941, Japan attacks USA at Pearl Harbor, which brings the United States into the war. Okay, so what that then means is, it means we have what we call the Grand Alliance, which is our first thing on the specification. This is the alliance during World War II between USA, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Okay, and what we see is this alliance is very interesting because you might have already noticed already, like Britain goes to war, don't they, to defend Poland against Germany, but actually the Soviet Union also attacked Poland as well. So what's interesting is Britain end up allied with the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they had also invaded Poland at the start of World War II. And despite them being in an alliance with each other, there are key differences between the nations. Okay, so the Soviet Union is communist. Okay, they had a communist revolution in 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin. Fundamentally, it meant the country was very different from the United States. Okay, and what ended up happening in the Soviet Union is they ended up having a one-party state. It was the Communist Party. There were no clear classes like there were in inequality as well, like in capitalism. But what we saw, like communism in the Soviet Union, it meant that like all property, all the means of production were owned by the state, the government. Okay, so the government had a lot more control over people's lives in the Soviet Union. In the United States, capitalists, freedom of elections, more inequality though, but crucially private ownership. And this is going to be one key feature of the Cold War, is them both wanting to spread their ideology to other countries in the world. We can call that expansionism. And the history of this is quite interesting because you might not be aware of this, but when the Communist Revolution took place at that time it was called Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin, well, Britain and USA, they actually supported the groups that were opposed to the communists in Russia at that time. And there was a civil war between around 1918 to 1921 between the whites versus the reds. The reds were the Bolsheviks. The whites were army officers who were like more loyal to the Tsar and other right-wing groups as well in Russia. Well, actually, USA and Britain, they both supported the whites in the Russian Civil War against the Reds. Okay, so this isn't that long before World War II, is it? 20 or so years. So despite them being an alliance during World War II, what I say to students, it's an alliance that you wouldn't have predicted in the 1930s, really, and it was an alliance really for what we might say would be pragmatic reasons. They wanted to defeat Nazi Germany. And I said before, the way World War II started, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, Germany invaded them from the west. This meant that Britain was actually on the same side as a side that had invaded Poland at the start of World War II, but yet they're fighting against the side that had also invaded Poland. That's why it's very interesting to consider that. But ultimately, they're in the Grand Alliance together. They have very different views on how countries should be run. Also, one last thing on this is the whole theory of communism. Just go back. It was a theory written by Marx and Engels in the 1800s. They said that once revolution happens in one country, it will spread to other revolutions throughout Europe and then the world. They thought it was like history was for a series of different stages, and it would go from capitalism to socialism, then to communism. Okay, so it's important for the Soviet Union to try and spread communism, because if it's not going to spread, it means their ideology they base their political beliefs on and how they run the country would be wrong. Like Marx and Engels would be wrong. Okay, so during World War II, the leaders, we call them the Big Three. We've got Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill, leader of Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, who is leader of the USA. We call them the Big Three. They're three big leaders of their countries when we look back through history. Like if you think of one of Britain's most famous prime ministers, it'd be Churchill. If you think of one of the most famous leaders of the Soviet Union, it would be Stalin. The only president to actually serve more than 2 terms in office, so he served more than 8 years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, famous to the 1930s with his New Deal response to the Great Depression. Okay, but in terms of the Cold War, there's just a little description about each of them below their photograph. So Stalin, he was convinced, he thought that the West here, we're referring to USA, Britain, France as well, thought they wanted to destroy communism. Okay, Churchill, he was conservative. He was a conservative prime minister. He would very much be against communism. Okay, he was deeply suspicious of communism. He was against, for example, like the establishment of the NHS after World War II, for example. And then Roosevelt, he saw Stalin as being important for support against Japan in the Second World War. So he wanted Stalin on side, really, for when war in Europe finished, to fight against the Japanese. But as I said before, what was starting to be clear during World War II is what was emerging after the war was that these 2 new superpowers were emerging afterwards. That's the Soviet Union and USA. Right, we move on to what the students love, which is, I'm obviously joking here, is the conferences. And I think these are hard because it might be quite easy to get the conferences mixed up. So you need to know, as it says in the specification, about the outcomes of Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Okay, and I said before, what can be hard about them is you might know about them all, but then in the exam you might get them mixed up. Okay, so a good way to remember it is the yellow pineapple because of Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, the yellow pineapple. What we're going to do is we're going to look through conference by conference, and we're going to explore background to it and what the outcomes were. Before we look at that, though, it's important to understand before these conferences that there was underlying tension within the Grand Alliance. Okay, Stalin believed that the USA and Britain were delaying opening up a second front. Okay, what we mean by a second front is USA were engaged in brutal conflicts against Germany on the Eastern Front over here. Okay, so what Stalin and the Soviet Union wanted is they wanted a second front to open. Okay, essentially meaning, so it would mean that Germany would be fighting, on two fronts. So yeah, and like Churchill, the UK Prime Minister, he didn't really trust Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe, and it says there particularly regarding Poland. Okay, Churchill was worried what might happen to these Eastern European countries after World War II. Arguably, he was right to kind of think that when we look at what happens later on. But there was also conflict about how the Soviet Union were behaving during World War II. So there was that massacres were revealed, where there was a massacre of Polish officers in Katyn Forest in 1943, which became exposed. Also, as well, like when the Soviet Union are coming in from the east, in Poland, the capital Warsaw, there was an uprising in the ghetto, which is where Jewish people were, and the Soviet army didn't really support them doing it. So what the USA and Britain were kind of thinking, well, are they leaving Poland to be like vulnerable, so the Soviet Union can dominate them afterwards? So each conference, what I have on the screen is a screenshot of that World War II day by day. You can see the situation of what is happening in the war, in World War II. So with Tehran, it's the only one from 1943, and the other two conferences, Yalta, Potsdam, are from 45. So I always say to students, the way to remember this one is if it comes up with 1943, and it's clearly 2 years before the end of World War II, the meeting is mainly about strategy on how to win World War II. Okay, and you can see here the leaders. Tehran is the capital of Iran. That's where they met. What were the agreements? The main one being the second front. Okay, Britain, USA, they agreed to open up a second front. The following summer, they do, 1944 in June, and that is what we call D-Day, where they attack on the beach of Normandy. That's the first agreement to remember. The second one is Stalin agreed to declare war against Japan, supply Soviet troops, once the war in Europe was over. Okay, so the priority at this point was still defeating Nazi Germany for the Soviet Union. They also discussed what should happen to Germany, but I think with this one, the division of Germany happens. The agreements are at Yalta, so I wouldn't worry as much about remembering that for Tehran. It was also agreed the Soviet Union could keep land it had from Poland. And they had an agreement they would set up the new international body to replace the League of Nations. That would be the United Nations that's set up at Yalta. Okay. But what I would do is two to remember for Tehran are really the second front and Stalin declaring war against Japan once the war in Europe is over. Okay. Right. So this is where we're going to the plans. If you got a question, explain the importance of the Tehran conference for. It could be relations between the superpowers or relations between USA and the Soviet Union. What would we say? Why is it important? Right, the first big meeting developed foundations to their alliance and how kind of post-war cooperation would work. The first paragraph, I'll do this as 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, I would write about a couple of the agreements. Okay, I would say the second front. You'll know about that and about how actually relations between them is actually relatively strong compared to what happens later on. Like the Cold War certainly hasn't happened yet. I would also say about the Stalin Soviet Union declaring war on Japan once the war in Europe was over. Okay, so paragraph 1, I'd do about the agreements from it if it's about importance. Paragraph 2, though, I'd write about underlying tension. Okay, I'd write about those things about how Stalin was thinking that the USA and Britain were delaying opening up that second front. They thought that they were trying to make the USSR, the Soviet Union, weaker. It's a little bit like a fight taking place, and you've got somebody on the outside looking in. They're waiting for the fight to finish before they come in and could kind of take Europe for themselves. Is what the Soviet Union thought USA and Britain believed. Okay. I'd say as well, the Churchill being suspicious of Stalin, particularly over Poland, would be something as well I'd write about in that underlying tension. So, Tehran agreements, it's mainly about winning World War II, but there is some underlying tension within it. Right, the second conference. Have a quick look at the screen. You could pause it. What's happened by this conference? You can even look back at the first one. What we see is the second front has happened, isn't it? The agreement at Tehran. This becomes D-Day in 1944. USA, Britain, Canada, they are advancing in from the west. The Soviet Union have come even further in from the east. Okay, but what's happening is these countries of Eastern Europe. We're talking here about Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These countries are, in theory, they're being liberated by the Soviet Union. They're being liberated from Nazi Germany, aren't they? However, we're going to see what happens to them, whether or not they are liberated. Okay, so Yalta, which took place in February of 45. Remember, Tehran is 1943. It still had the big three: Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. So, what were some of the outer agreements? The big one is Germany split into 4 zones. Okay, 4 zones of occupation. Britain has one, French has another, US has another, Soviet Union have another one. Soviet Union weren't particularly happy about that because their zone was actually the poorest economically out of the 4 zones. And this was with the zones. The idea of this would be it was seen as being a short-term thing. Okay, it actually lasts for 4 years. We'll look at the Berlin crisis later on in Key Topic 1. But it was seen as being like a temporary one. They didn't want the other side to have complete control of it. They would have seen as that going against their kind of foreign policy aims. Also, as well, they didn't want to give Germany independence. Because they believed that they thought that Germany might start another war, probably. So yeah, with this one, the Nazi Party was banned. It was agreed. They agreed Germany would pay reparations as well. Soviet Union, the war was a lot more devastating on them, so half reparations went to them. Crucially, at Yalta as well, it was agreed that Berlin would be divided, and it would mirror the occupation zones that we had in the whole of Germany. Okay, so you can see the zoomed-in Berlin. Hopefully, you remember this from doing it in your course. This would be really important because later on in the Cold War, Berlin is a key area of tension, like in the Berlin crisis of 48 to 49, or in the late 50s, early 60s, with the building of the Berlin Wall. Right, another agreement though, United Nations is set up. You might know from learning history, or you might know already. There was a League of Nations that was established as part of the Treaty of Versailles after World War One. Ultimately, its aim was to not have another world war. That fails, so they established a new international body. The main aim is to do with international diplomacy, countries, their relationship with other countries. The key aim, though, is to avoid another world war, really. And we see all nations can join it. Stalin wants to have, because the Soviet Union is 16 Soviet republics, he wanted them to have individual membership. However, only 3 end up getting granted: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. But ultimately, that means the Soviet Union is in it. Crucially as well, at Yalta, Stalin agreed that free elections would be held in Eastern Europe. He would go back on that promise. And it was Poland that was the clear stumbling block at Yalta. So they both agreed where the border of Poland should actually be, but it was who should run Poland. So when Germany invaded Poland that started World War II, the Polish government came to London. We can call them the London Poles. Okay, so Britain, USA supported them being able to return and govern the country, whereas Stalin wanted a more pro-communist government there. They also couldn't agree on how much reparations Germany should pay. Okay, so they delay the decision until the next conference. And what we kind of see is the reparations one is one that was a lot of it looked like there had been kind of progress made on reparations at Tehran, the first one. However, it was one that we see is discussed at all the conferences. Okay, so if you've got a question, explain the importance of the Yalta Conference for tension between USA and the Soviet Union, or exploring the development of the Cold War, or relations between superpowers, I'd do it as 2 paragraphs. Okay, first paragraph about the agreements. Okay, Germany, Berlin divided into 4 zones. The United Nations being set up. The free elections that Stalin agrees that Eastern Europe can have. But then, just like Tehran, I'd also do the second paragraph as that this time, rather than underlying tension, maybe like even underlying disagreements, by Yalta it's clear there are now divisions, particularly over Poland there. We mentioned before about Britain, USA wanting the London Poles being able to run the country again. Okay, but I'll also do as well the amount of reparations. They couldn't agree over how much reparations Germany should pay. Stalin wanted the harsh amount. He believed that they'd suffered a lot economically. They want compensation for that. But USA and the UK, they remember about the Treaty of Versailles, and you might know about that already, and about how if you inflict severe reparations on a country, it can lead to a country being destabilised, and it can lead to what we see actually led to a Second World War, didn't it? Okay, so that's the way I'd do it. Then we go to our final conference, Potsdam, July to August 1945. By this point, war in Europe was over. Okay, so Japan are still fighting in the Far East, but Germany surrendered in May of 1945. There are though some big changes to this one. So the big 3 are no more. The only one that stays in is Joseph Stalin. Winston Churchill loses the 1945 general election to the Labour Party and Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee comes in, and his government actually introduced the National Health Service in 1948. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he died in April 1945, and he was replaced by his vice president, who then became president, which was Harry Truman. And I always say to students, like anything, like, yeah, there have been disagreements at Yalta. However, the sides had been developing relationships, like personally, with each other. Okay, so Clement Attlee, he, rather than focusing on like Europe and world issues, he really wanted quick negotiations. He had things domestically he wanted to focus on. Okay, and Harry Truman, I always say about him, he had a get tough approach to the Soviet Union and Stalin. And what he did is he actually delayed the conference until after the atomic bomb had been tested, as a way of kind of showing Stalin, we're the new boss around here, really. But didn't necessarily work. So with the new president, okay, Harry Truman, he didn't like communism. I said before, he had a get tough approach to Stalin and the Soviet Union. He once remarked that he was tired of babying the Soviets, and that the only language Stalin understood was, how many army divisions do you have? Okay, so the relationship clearly wasn't going to be a strong one with Truman's background. I said before, the atomic bomb was a big aspect of context to understand for Potsdam, because it was tested successfully the day after the conference begun. It had been developed in secret, okay. Stalin did know about it through spies, okay. He had a spy network, so he knew about this, the Manhattan Project, which is what it was called, to develop the atomic bomb. However, I think Truman, the outcome Truman expected with having the atomic bomb was probably different to what he expected would happen, because Truman, as it says there, he says, "I'll sure have a hammer on those boys." Okay, so he basically believed that if we have the atomic bomb and contest it, we can get our own way with negotiations at Potsdam. Okay, because he's got this clear advantage in having the nuclear bomb, atomic bomb, and that Stalin and the Soviet Union don't have. Okay, it's a little bit like turning up to a meeting and you're holding a gun, and then you're thinking, well, I'm going to get my way of the meeting because I'm holding the gun. Okay, however, I would say for the Soviet Union though, it almost had the opposite response of Stalin. He wanted to make the Soviet Union more secure and make Eastern Europe become like a buffer zone of the Soviet Union. We'll look at that more in a minute. Okay, these are the two spies mentioned: Klaus Fuchs, Rudolf Perls. Probably pronounced that wrong. They were Soviet spies who reported back information. So these spies as well were important for early Cold War tension. Okay, so we had that tension with the atomic bomb. We also have the disagreements as well. Okay, they still couldn't agree over how much they should make Germany pay in reparations. Okay, as I said before, the Western allies were like USA, Britain worried it'd be repeating the mistakes of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles. Crucially, though, as well, they couldn't reach agreement over Eastern Europe. Okay, I mentioned those countries before. We're talking about Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Okay, at Yalta, the previous conference, it was agreed that free elections could be held in Eastern Europe. Okay, however, by the time of Potsdam, the Red Army, which is the Soviet Army, was still in control of Poland, and the Soviet Union were in the process of setting up a communist government. Okay, so Stalin is breaking the terms that they'd agreed over what would happen to the Eastern European countries at the second conference, the Yalta conference. There's a little summary for each of the leaders of the USA and Soviet Union in terms of what they wanted to happen to Eastern Europe. For Stalin, Eastern Europe was very important because if we think back through Soviet history, Russia has been invaded quite a lot of times, isn't it? In the Napoleonic times, in the early 1800s, also World War One, also as well in World War Two. So Stalin wanted the countries of Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. These countries here, a little bit like a cushion against possible future invasion from Europe. Okay, but Truman, the US president, he wants Eastern Europe to reject communism. He wants there to be free elections ultimately, which don't happen, as we'll see soon. So if you get a question about the importance of the Potsdam conference, this was the question in 2018 or 2019 was the importance question they asked about that. So they could repeat it again. I'll do it as two paragraphs. I do about the leadership changes, growing tensions. We mentioned them already. And I'll also do as well about the atomic bomb and the wartime alliance kind of collapsing. And a good phrase for this is the wartime alliance is turning into peacetime hostility. Okay. There's another few things I haven't mentioned on this as well, but like the atomic bomb that led to the arms race, which is what we'll look at in a minute, where both US and Soviet Union were competing against each other to develop the most up-to-date technology and the most powerful weapons. Okay, which we'll look at now actually. So America. So after Potsdam, America ends World War II by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima, and then I think it's a few days later on Nagasaki, and then the Japanese government surrender. I said before that like Truman believed that the atomic bomb would allow the United States to have influence over the Eastern European countries in that it would get them more freedom, maybe free elections. But as we said, Stalin wanted to make the Soviet Union more secure. Okay, we've just got here a little bit. This is from BBC Bitesize about the blast. It's going to change the world forever, really, wasn't it? And thankfully, an atomic bomb hasn't been dropped on civilians since the end of World War II. So there's a debate whether or not nuclear weapons have actually made the world a safer place. Okay, why were the bombs dropped is interesting because the USA wanted to force the Japanese government to surrender, but there are others that believe as well that there were political purposes as well, because it sent that warning to the Soviet Union about how strong America were. Okay, and as I said before, this would change warfare forever. It would mean a constant theme of the Cold War is actually that arms race and them trying to develop nuclear weapons, and we'll see that throughout the rest of the Cold War. And we see the Soviet Union steps up its own program of atomic research. This is the arms race, and so the American nuclear hegemony, which means that like America they were on their own with having a nuclear weapon. It wouldn't last long. It lasted 1949. Soviet Union developed theirs in 1949. Yeah, as it says there. And later on in the 60s, we see Britain, France, China also develop an atomic bomb. And what this is really important is it's really important for Cold War tension because the stakes of warfare have changed, haven't they? So now if there's going to be a war between the two, they could completely annihilate each other. Whereas before, it might be more of a kind of like an isolated ground invasion where it wouldn't affect as many people. And so in that sense, the tensions could increase, but also as well, it meant they were more reluctant to go to war. And that's a feature of the Cold War. So we see in the Cold War, don't we, the USA and the Soviet Union, they don't go to war directly. That's why it is called the Cold War. Okay. On the screen there, if you're looking at the arms race, there's some key things that you can add onto your timeline. So USA developed the atomic bomb in 45, Soviet Union developed theirs 49. They then the hydrogen bomb is another form of a nuclear bomb that's a lot more powerful than the atomic bomb. That USA developed that in 52, Soviets developed that in 53, and then in 1957, both USA and Soviet Union developed intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, they're nuclear warheads. Hydrogen bombs, atomic bombs, they are bombs that a plane flying over above has to be dropped out. Okay, so as I said before, Truman thought the atomic bomb could lead to the countries of Eastern Europe being free to choose how they wanted to be governed in elections. Stalin wanted to make the Soviet Union more secure. And what we see is the countries of Eastern Europe, they end up all becoming communists between 1945 to 47. I mean, Czechoslovakia is in 48, but generally it's between 45 to 47. But Czechoslovakia 48. There's a common theme in each of them. We see rigged elections, violence, the Soviet Union intervening and helping establish a one-party state, which is the Communist Party. There's a little bit more about that there. Yeah, backed by Stalin, communists took over the civil service, the government workers, media, security, defense, and then they held elections, but are often fixed, rigged to ensure support for the communists. And after that, all other parties would be banned, and it would be essentially a dictatorship, really. But what we call these countries is from when they become communist, we call them satellite states of the Soviet Union. So that term, it kind of means they're under their sphere of influence. They're not part of the Soviet Union, but they are under their influence. If you do want to, and what I would do is, if you're aiming for a grade 9, you want to know a couple of examples of what happened in there. I wouldn't say you have to know every single Eastern European country and what happened, but it is good to have a specific country that you know about how it ended up becoming communist and a one-party state. Okay, so if you got asked the question, why was the development of the arms race? Why was the development of the atomic bomb important? You can say increased tension. And it's starting the arms race, okay? That would be the main thing I'd do in there. You could also say as well, second paragraph, about how it strengthened Soviet control over Eastern Europe. So remember all about that buffer zone and about how Stalin wanted to make the Soviet Union more secure. So it says there, tighten control over Eastern Europe. And then if you got asked the question, why was the creation of satellite states in Eastern Europe important? You could say it's probably the first huge thing where there's a real breakdown in trust, because by them taking over Eastern Europe, which is essentially what the Soviet Union did, they were breaking the promises made at Yalta, weren't they? Remember at Yalta, it was agreed that the countries of Eastern Europe could have free elections. That wasn't allowed. The West saw it as an example of expansionism. It showed the divide, the divide between them. As I said before, it says at the bottom there, it helped mark end of wartime cooperation, beginning of Cold War hostility. Okay, and then what I'd say kind of with this, so short term it's important, but also longer term it's hugely important for like how the Cold War develops later on. So we're going to see later on in the Cold War, in Key Topic 1, Hungarian Uprising, Key Topic 2, Czechoslovakia, they become the key battlegrounds in the Cold War. Okay, and it almost like tests the Soviet Union in terms of how much they're willing to use force to maintain control. Also, it shows as well the West, USA, Britain, really powerless to intervene. Okay, behind the Iron Curtain, and I'll talk about the Iron Curtain in a minute. The Iron Curtain refers to this line here. Churchill coined it in a speech in 1946. Behind the Iron Curtain, USA, Britain couldn't really do much. Okay, and this division of Europe into the satellite states of East and the Western democracies, it'd be over 4 decades that would remain until around 1988, 89 is when they break away. Okay, right, we're moving on to the next part of the Cold War then. Remember, as we go through on your timeline, keep adding on the key things as we go through. So what we now have is, this is the first kind of policy that is quite negative towards the other superpowers. So we have the Kennan long telegram and the Novikov telegram. Okay, what this was, both Truman, US leader, Stalin, Soviet Union leader, they wanted to know what the other country was thinking. So they asked a diplomat who worked in the embassy in the country of the one they were based in. So Kennan, for example, he's an American citizen, but he works in the American embassy in Moscow. Okay, and likewise, that obviously the opposite with Novikov. They asked them to produce a report about what that country is thinking. Okay, so the Kennan long telegram is called a long telegram because it was quite long, but essentially it said Stalin wanted to see capitalism destroyed. Okay, but also said Soviet Union not suicidal if faced with strong resistance. Crucially, this leads to a key word that you've got to know, which is containment. Because after this, America decided to follow a foreign policy of containment. They try to contain communism from spreading, and that'll be really important when we look at the Truman Doctrine in a minute. The Novikov one was equally critical of the other country. Said that the USA wanted to use military power to dominate the world, and kind of said that since Roosevelt had died, USA weren't interested in working with the Soviet Union anymore. Okay, there's a couple of these sources. If you want to read through them, you can pause it. You can see the a little bit more depth about the telegrams. But if you got asked a question of them, why they're important, and I've grouped them together. Like, you could get asked a question just about the Kennan one, or just about the telegram one. About the Novikov one, or you could maybe get them both. You've got to sort of adapt at the time. I've kind of considered them both and why they're important. I'd say, increased Cold War tension. Increasing tension is going to be a classic thing you're going to write in your exam. You got about how they both portrayed the other superpower as a big threat, the distrust between them, and they both were important in turning the wartime alliance into peacetime hostility. Okay, and then so again with this one, it's a little bit like the short term, but then why they're important, you go more in the longer term. So the containment. It meant USA adopted the policy of containment, which led to things that we'll look at in a minute, which were the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Okay, and as a result of the containment with the Truman Doctrine, we'll see how the Soviet Union set up their own version of the Marshall Plan, Comecon, and essentially it leads to 3 or 4 years later, there's a clear divide in Europe with two political or ideological and economic blocks between the West and the East. And the telegrams were important in that happening. Okay? Right, it's not in the specification, but the books both write about it, and I think it's important to know. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Winston Churchill's in Missouri in America. He's no longer British Prime Minister. However, he represents the West. Okay, and also the fact that he was in the United States shows that his speech probably would have been cleared with Truman before he made it. Okay, essentially he says the Soviet Union is a threat to freedom and world peace. He says that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Essentially what he means by that is a curtain is normally made of something quite soft, isn't it? Like velvet. You can pull it back and see behind it. What he means by iron curtain is there's a curtain there, you can't see beyond it, can you? And that's what he meant by that, was like, and this speech was delivered in the context of the Soviet Union taking over control of Eastern Europe. Okay, right. We then move on to the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. So Marshall Plan is 48, but it happens. I often group these two things together because the Truman Doctrine happens. The speech happens, and then 3 months later, the Marshall Plan. It's kind of like setting out plans for how the Truman Doctrine would work. Okay, right. There's quite a few doctrines you got to remember in the Cold War exam. This first one we're coming across, it's like a policy of the government. It's essentially like Truman Doctrine means like Truman's foreign policy, really. Okay, it's important to understand the context of this. So after World War II, Europe was in ruins, wasn't it? Okay, there'd been fighting, bombing, all sorts. And in that particular environment, communism can often look quite attractive. Wealth is shared amongst people in communism. If you look at when Russia had their communist revolution in 1917, that had been the period of economic crisis during World War One. In 1917, there had been things like high inflation. Okay, so what the Truman Doctrine was, it was a speech in Congress. Truman officially announced economic aid to Greece and Turkey, $400 million. Remember, specific stats you want to remember. And they also sent American civilian and military personnel there. Okay, think of the USA saw communism as a bit like a rash. Okay, they saw that the Eastern European countries had already fallen to it. They were trying to protect what they thought were the next ones that were most vulnerable to turning communist: Greece and Turkey. Okay, you can see, this is from BBC Bitesize. This shows you quite well. Look, the communist ones, the countries of concern. That's where it went to. And then what the Marshall Plan was. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention as well. In Truman's speech, he spoke about a clear divide. He described countries having a choice between good versus evil, and he said that communism should not be allowed to grow. Okay, so it's really important because the telegrams were more private, weren't they? It was more going to shape policy, but like the telegrams wouldn't have been like published in newspapers. Truman Doctrine was probably the first time publicly. You could argue Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, but this is the first time publicly like a president or leader of the Soviet Union has actually actively spoken about the other side in like harsh terms. So what happened? What the Marshall Plan is it was 3 months after the Truman Doctrine. Okay, and it just set out on how aid would be provided. And with the Marshall Plan, it wasn't just Greece and Turkey. It provided economic aid to the Western Europe, essentially. Okay, so you've got there $12.7 billion of aid. That's a good stat to run between 48 and 52. You can see there the countries that got the aid. There was debate over whether to give it to Soviet Union satellite states. However, okay, those countries didn't accept it because they'd have had to have opened up and allowed their finances to be reviewed, which wasn't really going to happen in a communist economy that they had. It was all quite secretive. Okay, so United States knew it wouldn't happen. So we end up having countries getting the Marshall Plan aid and the countries that aren't. Okay, you can see there on the map. This is from Bitesize. The countries that got it, the countries that didn't. The Soviet response, they were outraged by it. They declared Marshall aid. Stalin declared it dollar imperialism. Okay, imperialism is a word that means like empires, and if you were imperialistic in the 1800s, it'd mean that you support having a strong British Empire, for example. Okay, so what Stalin believed was he thought that United States were using their dollar, using their economic might to essentially gain influence and create their own empire. Okay, and what ends up happening is, this is really important, is 1947, Cominform is set up. Okay, so it's called the Communist Information Bureau. That was to tighten Soviet control in Eastern Europe. We kind of say that like Cominform was set up as a result of the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so the Cominform was mainly about spreading propaganda, and then we see 1949 Comecon set up. Okay, and this was to give financial aid to the Eastern Bloc countries. So essentially, it's the Soviet Union's version of the Marshall Plan aid. Okay, but what's really important about this is that the world, like Europe's now divided, isn't it? You've got the countries getting the Marshall Plan aid and the countries that are getting the Comecon aid. Okay, so Europe is now divided between those two economic camps. Also, would say to two political camps as well. Ones that are based on the Truman Doctrine from USA, and also Cominform as well. Okay, so hugely important. Right, so what could you get asked a question? You could get asked a question just about the importance of the Truman Doctrine. They did ask in 2021 the importance of the Marshall Plan on its own. And I think with the Marshall Plan one, you can write about all those things about the Truman Doctrine as well, things like containment and stopping the spread of communism. However, what you've got to be clear, the Marshall Plan is, you probably wouldn't write as much about the speech that Truman made in Congress, okay? So what I've just got here is the first paragraph is reasons why the Truman Doctrine is important, and the second paragraph is reasons why the Marshall Plan is important, okay? I think I've pretty much mentioned a lot of those, but yeah, the bottom sentence there, I'll just quickly go over, like, cement long-term economic division, okay? And it meant that, like, East and West coming together in the future was going to be more unlikely, okay? I've also got, you could get asked about why Cominform or Comecon were important. So there you've just got some examples about why they're important. You gave the Soviet Union power to intervene in internal affairs of member states, strengthen Soviet control over the satellite states, over Eastern Europe. We can also call that the Eastern Bloc as well. And Comecon, pretty much the reasons why the Marshall Plan was significant are relevant to this, like Europe being divided into two economic camps. Okay, right. We're going to move then to our first kind of crisis of the Cold War, the Berlin Crisis of 1948 to 49. Students, and I think whenever they ask a question about this Berlin Crisis or the one from Key Topic 2 involving the building of the Berlin Wall, I think a sizable amount of students in the country would write about the wrong one. So it's very important to not get them mixed up. Okay, so we're going to be looking now at the one from Key Topic 1, 1948, the Berlin Crisis. So add this onto your timeline. A little bit of context, if you remember, Germany at Potsdam was divided into 4 zones. Sorry. Germany at Yalta was divided into 4 zones. Berlin also was divided into 4 zones. Remember, Berlin is within the Soviet zone, okay? So it's a little bit like you've got the US zone in Germany here, but also that's that little section of Berlin that's there as well, okay? By 1948, what's happened? What's the story? Well, 2 of the zones end up joining together and creating Bizonia, okay, 2 of the Allied zones. They then create, after that, Trizonia, okay? So Bizonia, you don't need to write about that. But Trizonia, so what it was economic unity. So they introduced a new currency into Trizonia. Think of it as like, I would say Triceratops, the dinosaur, has like 3 horns, doesn't it? So tri means 3, bi means 2. So Trizonia, 3 kind of zones joined together. They introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, economic unity, which the Soviet Union were left out of. So Stalin thought, USA, Britain, France, which we call the West, he thought they were ganging up on them, okay? There were 2 or 3 agreed like land routes that linked Western Berlin to the rest of Western Germany. And what Stalin decides to do is he decides to shut them off. And this is what we call the Berlin blockade, okay? What these land routes would be, there'd be like a train line or like a motorway, something like that. And they were blocked at the border, okay? What Stalin really wanted to show is that he wanted to show that like a divided Germany and a divided Berlin would not work, okay? And he probably was thinking, like, the book doesn't mention this, but I think what he was probably thinking is that USA, Britain and France, they don't want to let the people of West Berlin starve to death, okay? The trade routes to bring in supplies, he thinks if we block them off, it's going to mean that Britain and USA are going to think, right, well, we'll give up control over Western Berlin. Stalin also thought, well, he knew the West knew that any kind of attempt to force any of those supplies could be seen as an act of war, okay? So what ends up happening? The Berlin blockade leads to, and it's all part of the same crisis, the Berlin airlift. Pilots bravely took off from Trizonia, from what would become later on West Germany, but the western part of Germany, that part of the zone, flying in food, coal, at huge risk, but they flew in 1,000 tons of supplies each day. Okay, here's a little thing from Bite Size about it. West Berlin only had enough food for 36 days. So rather than forcing supplies in through the ground, it was mainly US pilots, but British I think were involved as well. They flew in supplies in the air, and they landed in airfields in the western part of West Berlin. Okay, the cartoon might have been tempting for Stalin to to shoot down one of these planes that was flying in. Right, this is a little bit more context about the reaction of it. I kind of covered this already, but you can just see there that like keeping West Berlin supplied cost the USA $350 million, Britain £17 million, and it lasts for 11 months. Okay, the blockade is lifted, so Stalin lifts the blockade, allows the land routes to open again in May of 1949. Okay, we kind of say from the Western's point of view that like Stalin his attempt to win the propaganda victory backfired. I mean, he probably would have seen it as something different from the time. Obviously, it depends whose view you're looking at it from. But crucially, the Berlin crisis led to really, really important outcomes that you need to know. Okay, so West Germany is formally announced as like a formal country 3 days after the end of the blockade. Okay, and East Germany follows quite soon afterwards. Okay, so what it leads to the formal division of Germany. So rather than being like these zones of occupation from Potsdam up to 1949 now, rather than being that, we now have formally West Germany and East Germany. West Germany's the Federal Republic of Germany, East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Okay. Also, not long after the Berlin crisis, we see the establishment of NATO. Okay, in 1949, NATO is a military alliance. The idea is collective security, and Article 5 or 6 of it, I can't remember which one, states that an attack on one member state is an attack on all. So essentially, if you're Norway in NATO, if you're attacked, it means that like United States will protect you. Okay, that's important. We'll look at why that's important in a bit when we look at the exam question. But it's important because we also see the Warsaw Pact established in 1955. It's 6 years after, so it's a fair amount of time after. But one of the reasons why the Warsaw Pact established is because West Germany joined NATO in 1955. Okay, and the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union, the East equivalent of NATO. Okay, so what's really important about this is we've mentioned before, like after World War II, the Truman Doctrine in Cominform. Europe is now divided into two political camps, okay? Marshall Plan, Comecon. Europe now divided into two economic camps. Now we've got NATO and the Warsaw Pact. We've now got Europe and the world divided into two military alliances, okay? Let's do the importance of the Berlin crisis question first, and then we'll talk about the NATO and Warsaw Pact after. So if you're going to do why it's important, I don't know if they've asked an importance question about it. It's been a narrative question before, which we'll look at later on. I just think you could talk about the crisis initially, like what happened involving it, how it increased tension, and about how far Stalin was willing to go to keep power and to try and make kind of Berlin become part of the Soviet territory. Okay, and then I'd probably say the second paragraph, how important it is for being the first major confrontation. I've got that sets the tone for decades of tension that follows. So wars avoided, and actually it shows that like the sides are willing to go to the brink and do extreme things to actually avoid war from happening. Okay. Then also as well, I'd just say it led to the formal division of Germany, and also as well NATO and the Warsaw Pact being created. Okay. I've also got as well it remained a Cold War hotspot. Okay. So again, like other ones, paragraph 1, like the short-term crisis, the second paragraph, think of it more like long-term importance in the Cold War, okay? And then why is NATO and the Warsaw Pact important? Well, you could get asked a question about just NATO or just the Warsaw Pact. They what you'd write could be quite similar for both of them. I think it shows the division between East and West, accelerated the arms race, world divided into two rival military blocs. They're things you could apply to both, couldn't you? I think specifically to each one, though, you could say for NATO, it showed USA, Western Europe, that USA were willing to intervene if there was going to be a threat of Soviet expansion. And with the Warsaw Pact, you'd say it like maintain that strong military presence on the satellite states. So we're going to see that later on, like Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The Warsaw Pact is used as a way of justifying intervention in those countries when they try and stray away from from communism. Okay, right. We haven't got too much more left. We're now moving on to the arms race, which carries on in the 50s. We've spoken about the arms race earlier on. Here you've got, this is from the Hodder textbook. It's a good little graph which kind of shows how much USA and the Soviet Union are spending on arms from 1949 to 53, and you can just see ultimately that it increases. Each grenade represents, and there's a number on there as well, number in billion dollars. Okay, but crucially, it leads to mutually assured destruction. Mad, because both sides know it's essentially, if they attack another side with nuclear weapons, it's essentially a suicide pact. So both sides realise that in the Cold War, and it does mean that war doesn't happen. So if you've got a question about why is the arms race important, it's important to look at what year frame it's asking you. But I've just gotten there about how first tested in 45, it led to the mistrust at Potsdam, which arguably is where the Cold War, you could trace its roots to. It led to the Stalin wanting control over Eastern Europe. It led to technological military competition with hydrogen bomb, intercontinental ballistic missiles, those things I mentioned. And I've got more as well, that it becomes a defining feature of the Cold War. Okay, a lot of the things we look at later on, it's to do with nuclear weapons. Like we look at Cuba, to do with nuclear weapons. Even when we look at Tom, that's to do with nuclear weapons as well, about limiting them. Okay, that fear of escalation meant that Cold War didn't lead to a hot war or open warfare. Okay, so I've just got some examples of later on as well about how important it was for future events that took place. Okay, right, going further into the 50s, we have I mentioned at the start, with the new leader Eisenhower for Harry Truman. One way of remembering presidents is constitutionally they can only serve 2 terms, which is 8 years, and they have an election every 4 years. So generally, when you look at them, they often are 4 or 8 years. I mean, there are exceptions with JFK, who was assassinated 2 years into his time, or like Nixon, who resigned over Watergate later on. But generally, it's often 8 years. Okay, so we've got Dwight Eisenhower, and then we have, for the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Okay. You don't need to know this in much depth, but it's good to know that during this period of 50-53, there is the Korean War, where the Soviet Union supported North Korea, USA supported South Korea. So they weren't directly fighting each other, but they found themselves on opposite sides. But it's not in the specification, so it's not a major thing that you're going to be asked on. Okay, right. So the last part, Key Topic 1, the Hungarian Uprising. Okay, so this takes place in Hungary, one of the satellite states. And what is an uprising? Act of resistance or rebellion, as it says there. So the situation for Hungary, they became a satellite state like the other ones due to, it says there that the secret police eliminated political rivals, and they had a leader who was called Rakosi, who's on the right-hand side here. Okay, and he was a hardline communist, fully in league with Moscow, basically meaning he's very loyal, and he's going to run Hungary exactly how the Soviet Union's run. Okay. So in Hungary, there's no freedom of speech, secret police, the AVH, fear, like climate of fear, as it says there. There are also Soviet troops stationed in Hungary, and the Soviet economy used to actually drain the Hungarian economy. Okay. Also, as well, the final bit there: Russian language forced on the people. Hungarian street signs replaced with Russian versions. So all of that meant that the people of Hungary weren't particularly happy with their situation, okay? What's also really important that you write about of Hungary, the context to it, is de-Stalinization, okay? Because Khrushchev becomes leader after Stalin. In 1956, he makes a secret speech, which does get leaked out, and people in Eastern Europe find out about it, okay? It says that it didn't really remain a secret. He essentially denounces Stalin, okay, and announces changes. So in the Soviet Union, things are, terror's ended, the Gulag system, which are the forced labor camps, are shut down. But people in the Eastern Bloc, people in the Eastern Europe or the satellite states that we're talking about here, they thought, well, hang on a minute, could we get greater freedom now? Like, people in the Soviet Union are getting greater freedom. Can this lead to, our situation changing? Okay, so in Hungary, People began to protest against Krokow's regime. He was replaced by someone called Erno Gero, probably pronounced that wrong. I don't think it's majorly important you remember his name, because what ends up happening is the person to remember is Imre Nagy, okay? Because the Soviets agreed to a new government being formed under a liberal reformer, someone who's going to want to make changes, called Imre Nagy, okay? With Nagy, it's pronounced Nagy, but it's spelt Nagy, he believed that you should still have communism, but there should be personal freedom. And what he does is he announces changes that he's going to make to Hungary. So free elections to choose the government, impartial legal system with fair trials. That would weaken the role of the secret police. He wants the total withdrawal of the Soviet army from Hungary, and also farmers allowed to private ownership of their land instead of it being state controlled. Okay, and at this point, Khrushchev may have allowed it. Okay, in Czechoslovakia, we see in '68 somebody else called Dubček introduced liberal reforms, and they're invaded. But I think what happens with Nagy is like Khrushchev was more liberal than Brezhnev. Khrushchev was probably going to be more willing to allow a satellite state leader to get away with more. However, Nagy goes too far, and he announces that they will leave the Warsaw Pact. And you got to think at this point, for Khrushchev, if he allows them to leave the Warsaw Pact, won't Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria also do the same thing? And would it weaken the Soviet Union? They'd no longer have that buffer zone. So, yeah, just what I explained there. So, Khrushchev refused to accept Hungary leaving. He thought there'd be a buffer zone in the in Eastern Europe. And what's the response? The Soviet Union, they decided to invade Hungary. 1,000 tanks roll into Budapest. The fight that the supporters of Nagy put up, we call it the Hungarian Uprising. And they beg the West for support. Okay? The Soviet troops coming in, very brutal. 20,000 Hungarians killed. Remember, statistics to remember. Ones like that are good to remember. It's a lot more bloodier than what happens in Czechoslovakia in Key Topic 2 in 1968. Okay, and what ends up happening is Nagy, I'm not sure if I've got it on here, but yeah, Nagy is tried and executed. He's replaced by a new communist government. We call him like a hardliner, Janusz Kadar. Okay, someone who's going to be loyal to Moscow. And Khrushchev said, Nagy's death is a lesson to the leaders of all communist countries. Okay, so what's important about this? You could get as a narrative question, and it was a narrative question in 2019, I think. We'll look at that question in a bit. But it's important to understand the kind of the outcome of it. So Nagy thought USA and other Western countries would come to their support. Okay, he probably saw the Marshall Plan and thought, they're willing to help economically. And what did come was help, but not really. It was more it was more like you're doing a good job kind of thing. There were radio messages broadcast to them, urging them to rise up. However, no military support offered. Okay, and this is really important because it shows us containment, which was the policy as a result of the Truman Doctrine and formed as a result of the Kennan telegram. It shows they were willing to help stop communism spreading to countries that weren't yet communist, but they're not willing to intervene in countries that are already communist. Okay, and the thinking behind it would be, by this, it's mutually assured destruction, isn't it? Military attack on the Soviet satellite state that could trigger nuclear war. Okay, Time magazine, they declared the Man of the Year the Hungarian freedom fighter. Okay, so there was positive press about the Hungarian freedom fighters in the West. What happened for Khrushchev made his position more secure. He was shown that he wasn't willing to kind of back down and let these countries get away with it and do what they wanted. So in the Warsaw Pact, it meant Khrushchev's position was more secure. So we don't really mention another challenge to the Soviet control of Eastern Europe until 1968, 12 years after this. Okay, so Khrushchev knew as well that USA wouldn't take military action. Arguably reflected badly on the West. They weren't willing to back up words of military support. And the United Nations, they declared disgust at how the Hungarian government were treating their people. Aid money was raised. Communist parties in some Western countries, Italy, Britain, France, they began to change their opinion of the Soviet Union. Okay? And this is our last thing. The last thing for this key topic 1, why is the Hungarian Uprising important? I haven't got it as paragraph 1 or 2. I've just got all the reasons there. I think we just kind of covered that already. Like, yeah, damaged the West's reputation, showed the realities of the arms race. I'm at the bottom here at the moment. Showed the divisions amongst the communist parties. Italy and France, the communist parties cut ties with Moscow, but showed how Khrushchev's position was really secure. Reinforced Soviet control. But then the last thing I'll talk about is that, but yeah, exposed US limitations. So US chose not to intervene militarily, showed the boundaries of containment, and also highlighted realpolitik of the Cold War. Okay, realpolitik essentially means that the United States were thinking about like pragmatic reasons at the time for how they were going to respond to events. So they wanted freedom, but they were pragmatic with it. They didn't want to go to war over Hungary. Okay, right. So that is key topic 1, the knowledge finished. Okay, so as I said, hopefully you've done a timeline or you've made notes as we've gone through. Okay, what I've just got to finish up with is, for the first question, explain one consequence. I've just gone through all the things that I think they could ask you, and I've given. Let me just get it up here. Here we are. I've just gone. So if they ask you, explain one consequence of the Grand Alliance formed, on the right hand side, I've got what I'd write about. Okay. So for each of the things, so I'm not going to go through it. I'll just have that there. You can pause it if you want to look through it. Okay. And then you've got the second part of it. And then you've got the third part. So if you want to actually revise one consequence for each event, you can do. Okay. As I said though, with this, if you know how to answer the explain the importance question, the explain one consequence, the first question in the Cobble paper, will be quite straightforward. Okay. Then what I've got to finish up with today is just to look. There's been 3 examples of narrative questions they've asked about key topic 1. Okay. So the narrative question, which is the second question, you've got to think of like the start point, what are the events and what's the outcome. Okay. So 2 years ago, which is in 2023, they asked this question, a narrative account analysing US-Soviet relations in the years 45 to 47, okay? So what you just think about is this, right? What's the start point? What's the end point? What happens in between? This one, there's quite a lot you could write about, and it's only 8 marks. You know, you'd have about 15 minutes to do it. So I'd probably I'd write about the Yalta conference, then I'd go on to writing about the Potsdam conference, then you write about the telegrams, Truman Doctrine, and Marshall Plan, and Cominform and Comecon. Okay, but what you do is you'd say how one event led to the next thing happening. Like with the telegrams part, you'd be like the Kennan telegram. You say what it set out. You know, this led to the Truman Doctrine and their policy of containment. Things like that. It's important you're showing that clear sequence of events. Okay, so that's one time where they've asked it over a 2-year period. Usually though, it's about a specific crisis, the narrative question. So normally it's about like the Berlin crisis or the Hungarian Uprising. And in that case, you've got to think, right, what's the start point? What's the story and what's the outcome? So with the Berlin crisis, maybe have a little think now and pause it. Okay, what I would do is I'd start with like, I know the division of Germany happens a bit before it, but I've mentioned the division of Germany, Trizonia, the shared economic unity, how that led to Stalin deciding to cut off the land routes because he wanted to show a divided Berlin wouldn't work. I'd then write about the Berlin airlift and about how they flew in lots of supplies. I'd then write about how 11 months later the blockade was lifted and about the outcome. Because I think what you want to think about is what's the outcome of it? The outcome will be the formal division of Germany into West and East Germany, and also you could write about NATO being formed as well afterwards. Okay, and then we've just got the final narrative one is the one on the Hungarian Uprising. This is 20. They asked this. I think 2019 they asked this one. Yeah, they asked from 2019. You'd think, what's the start point? I'd maybe start with about how Hungary first became a communist satellite state, but not too much on that because you want to get into the events of 56. That's what the question's asking. And then you'd write about the protests. You'd write about de-Stalinisation. You'd say about how how that led to the protests happening, about the poor living standards, things like that. You'd write about how it led to Imre Nagy becoming the new prime minister and his liberal changes, about him looking to leave the Warsaw Pact. You then say this led to the invasion. You then finish with probably like the outcome of it, which I would say would be like the international reaction, the West not offering military support, and the maybe Khrushchev's position becoming more secure. Okay, right. Well, thank you for paying attention today. With Key Topic 1, I think it is the one with the most amount of knowledge in there. Okay, so if you can get Key Topic 1 nailed down, Key Topic 2 is just Berlin, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, 3 crises. Okay, so go away, learn that, and best of luck with your GCSEs coming up. Okay, see you later.